Hale Svandiari, the director of the Middle East program at the Wilson Center. I'd like to welcome you all to this meeting on Egypt in tumultuous times. Our speaker is Professor Samir Shehata, who is currently a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center and an assistant professor of Arab politics at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies in the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Dr. Shehata teaches courses on Arab and Middle East politics, comparative politics, U.S. foreign policy towards the Middle East, Egyptian politics, culture, and politics in the Arab world. He has written extensively, and his work has appeared in the Middle East Policy, International Journal of Middle East Studies, Arab Reform Bulletin, Georgetown Journal of International Affairs, Salon, Slate, Al Hayat, and other publications. He's currently working at the center on a book, Islamist Electoral Participation in the Middle East, Prospects for Democracy. Today he's going to focus on 4 subjects related to current domestic and foreign politics in Egypt. Political succession in Egypt, Egypt's involvement in the Gaza war, the new Arab Cold War, and the Obama administration and its likely outlook towards Egypt in the coming period. Could I ask you please to turn off your cell phones and your Blackberries, because it interferes with the live webcast that we have, and the live webcast can be picked up across the world, including Egypt. So, you should know. Welcome. You have 35 minutes. And
Great,
then
and you'll stop me if I go longer.
Yeah, and we'll open the floor to questions.
Sure. Well, thank you, Hale. And I'd also, of course, like to thank the Woodrow Wilson Center. It is a pleasure to be here for a year, relieved of teaching and administrative duties at Georgetown. And as Hale mentioned in the introduction, I do quite a bit of teaching. So it's a pleasure to be here. And when Hale asked me in early January to give a lecture through the Middle East program, I thought, and I think she thought, of course, rightly, that it was an incredibly timely time to do so because of Egypt's involvement, of course, in regional politics at the time, specifically in the context of the Gulf War, the Gaza War, on Egypt's border, and Egypt's role and position during the war, as well as Egypt's diplomatic efforts and maneuvers, as well as those of other regional players, Turkey, of course, Qatar, and so on, to bring the fighting to an end, or at least to achieve some kind of a truce. So I thought at the time that I would entitle my remarks as Egypt in Tumultuous Times, and I was quite ambitious, and I thought that I'd be able to cover 4 subjects. I think I'll disappoint a little bit today and cover really only 2 or 3 of those subjects, but I'm happy to speak about the others in the question and answer period. So my goals today really are to discuss or take up 3 topics. First, Egypt's position on and role in the Gaza war, including its actions or inactions during the war regarding the border, statements made by Egyptian officials and so on, and domestic politics and protest in Egypt during the war against Israel, but also against the Egyptian government's position with regard to the war. That's the first topic that I want to take up to some extent. The second one has to do with Egypt's position in regional politics during and after the war, what we might call, hearkening back to Malcolm Kerr's classic study of Arab politics in the 1950s and 60s, the new Arab Cold War. But really, this is a war that goes beyond the Arab world, so it might be the new Middle East Cold War, or possibly more accurately and more modestly, regional competition for influence and position between a number of states in the region, Egypt, Iran, Syria, Turkey, as well as, importantly, non-state actors, Hezbollah and Hamas. regional alignments. And then lastly, I want to more than address, really kind of think out loud with you about what this might mean, that is, Egypt's position and role during the Gaza conflict, as well as, what the future might hold for an Obama administration looking to engage with Egypt, whether this will result in any kind of a change of policy from the ones that we've seen over the last number of years with regard to the Bush administration's position towards Egypt. I'd be happy to talk about political succession. Also, I've written quite a bit about that if people are interested in it, but I think that, already this is a tremendous amount to deal with, so we'll try to limit my remarks to those things. So let me just say then at the beginning that this is really a policy talk, which should be familiar to those of you from Washington. There are really no theoretical or academic ambitions in my remarks today, so I'm going to be kind of quite modest in what I try to accomplish. Let me begin somewhat untraditionally by presenting my main points or my conclusions right at the beginning, right? And they are 5 primarily. First, Egypt's mediation efforts and the diplomatic actions of other Arab states were largely ineffective in bringing about the war's conclusion or exerting any pressure on Israel or the United States to bring the war to an end. In fact, one could go even further than this and state that discord among Arab states didn't contribute even to forming any kind of a unified position with regard to the conflict. And in fact, the end of the war was primarily determined by Israel and the ticking clock counting down the end of the Bush administration, an administration which has fully supported Israel during the war, as well as largely over the last 8 years, including the 2006 summer war between Hezbollah and Israel. And in fact, the hard deadline of the U.S. presidential inauguration on January 20. The second point is, quite simply, that Egypt's position during the war was tremendously unpopular and somewhat difficult to maintain, both in the Middle East, not just the Arab world, with significant demonstrations taking place in Turkey and elsewhere, as well as inside Egypt. And we saw a tremendous amount of political activity inside Egypt, more than we've seen for probably since 2005, 2006, in opposition to the regime. Thirdly, and maybe this is the most important point, that and I think this possibly offers a corrective to how we understand Egypt's role with regard to the Palestinian conflict, that we need to accurately understand the Egyptian government's outlook toward and relationship with Hamas. Egypt is by no means a neutral player or a mediator, independent of the conflict and impartial toward both parties. It is in many ways a direct party to the conflict. Of course, Egypt has a number of important and legitimate national security interests at stake. It wants peace and security on its northeastern border. Of course, as you probably know, that since 2005, there have been several breaches of that border, including an incident in which more than 100,000 Palestinians made it into Egypt largely to buy diapers and medicine. But in any case, there are legitimate national security interests there. Egypt doesn't want to see a situation in which it has to maintain hundreds of thousands of refugees in Sinai. And I think this is what's most important, that the Mubarak regimes, and I'm differentiating now between the Mubarak regime's position and interests and possibly Egypt's national security interests, go further and are different than this. You have to remember that, of course, the Mubarak regime is an ostensibly secular Arab regime aligned with the U.S., as well as Mahmoud Abbas's pro-U.S. Palestinian Authority, with a signed peace treaty with Israel and continuing and significant economic dealings with Israel, including the exportation of Egyptian natural gas to Israel, which is incredibly unpopular. Of course, it is also an increasingly unpopular regime, the Mubarak regime, which derives no legitimacy from any kind of electoral success. And we have to compare this and contrast this with Hamas, which is a popular resistance movement with some electoral legitimacy. And I think one of the conclusions of this point is one really wonders about the credibility and therefore the effectiveness of Egypt as a mediator between Hamas and Israel. Okay. The fourth point or conclusion is that in some ways the Egyptian government is likely to derive some benefit, at least vis-a-vis the United States, from the Gaza war and from Egypt's position and stances on the Gaza war, demonstrating once again to the U.S. and to Israel that Cairo is pivotal to American and Israeli interests in the region, and that this, of course, will likely come at some kind of a price. Cairo will likely try to extract something, even if it is going back to an old American policy that has little regard for Egypt's domestic concerns as a result of this position. And then finally, the fifth kind of point or conclusion is that the Gaza war and Egypt's position during the war highlights the regional divisions and competitions in the Middle East. And of course, the main fault lines in the region are not based, as we were told, after the Iraq war and after the rising influence and hegemony, supposedly, of Iran inside Iraq, as well as the supposed rising of Shia power and influence in other places, that the major fault lines really are not a Shia-Sunni divide, as many have claimed, but between the so-called, quote, moderate Arab states, regimes in the U.S. orbit and pliant to American interests, and both regimes, Iran and Syria, as well as popular non-state actors, Hamas and Hezbollah, and I would include the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, groups that are outside of American sphere of influence and reject U.S. regional hegemony. Okay, let me now briefly discuss the 3 points that I mentioned at the beginning in a little more detail. That is, Egypt and the Gaza war. Secondly, domestic and regional reaction to the war. And then I'll expand a little bit further on the new Cold War in the region, and I'll move to some kind of a conclusion about the possible implications of all of this for the U.S. and Egypt. Egypt and the Gaza war. Of course, as you know, the ceasefire that was brokered by Egypt between Hamas and Israel ended on December 19th, 2008. It was a 6-month ceasefire. And of course, conditions before the ceasefire ended were intolerable for Hamas and at the very least annoying for Israel. Of course, Hamas and the Palestinians in Gaza were largely blockaded from the outside world since the summer of 2007. And of course, there were continuing rocket attacks, but particularly increasing after November 4th, the November 4th incident in which Israel killed 6 Hamas gunmen in anticipation of their attempts to supposedly try to build a tunnel underneath the border for various reasons. So after the November 4th incident, Gaza was completely blockaded, and the number of rocket attacks into southern Israel increased. Egypt, of course, tried to mobilize its diplomatic and regional weight to some extent to avert a more intensive crisis, and quite unusually in some regards, Israel's foreign minister was invited to Cairo to meet with both President Mubarak, President Mubarak, as well as Foreign Minister Abul Ghait, and also, quite interestingly enough, of course, General of Intelligence Omar Suleiman, who some speculate is likely to be the next president of Egypt, if it is not Gamal Mubarak. So Livni is invited to Cairo for talks, which some speculated was somewhat unusual to begin with, and this takes place on December the 25th, 2008. And Mubarak, in the meetings, calls for Israeli restraint. And of course, after the meeting, Livni declares that, quote, enough is enough, and that Israel will respond to the rocket fire. 2 days later, of course, Israel launches a massive airstrike on the Gaza Strip, December 27th, and this is really the beginning of the war. And Egypt's reaction is quite interesting. Egypt, of course, condemns the bombing, but also has incredibly harsh words for Hamas, with Foreign Minister Abul Ghait scolding Hamas, saying, quote, these are my translations, Egypt warned Hamas for some time now, and who doesn't listen needs to take responsibility for the consequences. The Israeli Prime Minister stated that, this is Abul Gheit, of course, you must stop, otherwise we will respond. And he then scolds Hamas for lobbing 60 rockets into Israel the night before Livni arrives in Cairo. Now, and again, these are only reports and speculation, but on December 24th, the day before Livni arrives in Cairo, Al-Quds Al-Arabi, the Arab nationalist newspaper based in London, reports that, quote, Egypt has informed Israel that it would not object to a limited Israeli military operation in the Gaza Strip, unquote. And of course, the speculation is because of Egypt's anger towards Hamas for rejecting participating in a Cairo-based Palestinian National Reconciliation Conference the month before, in November. And in fact, Al-Quds Al-Arabi goes further and says that Omar Suleiman, of course, Egypt's head of general intelligence and who is the lead point person in terms of negotiating between Egypt and Israel, as well as Egypt and the different Palestinian factions, says that Khalid Mishal, the political head of Hamas based in Damascus, is the head of a, quote, gang, quote unquote, and that Egypt wanted to see the movement's leaders punished. He says, quote, supposedly, again, this is a report in Al-Quds Al-Arabi, the Hamas leaders have become very arrogant. It's time to teach these leaders a lesson so they would wake up from their dreams, unquote. Of course, you know the rest of the story with regard to the conflict. The fighting continues until January the 18th. It's really kind of not correct to say the fighting. The Israeli actions against Gaza continue until January the 19th, when Prime Minister Olmert announces an end, really a unilateral end, to Israel's military operations in Gaza. And of course, 2 days later, President Obama is inaugurated. Okay, let me move now to the second thing I want to discuss, which is domestic and regional reactions to the war. As I mentioned, Foreign Minister Livni was in Cairo on the 25th. So when the bombing begins on the 27th, Egyptian opposition papers print front-page pictures of Livni meeting with Mubarak, and then also meeting with Foreign Minister Abul Gheit. In fact, the pictures are ones in which they're both smiling and shaking hands, jovial. In fact, they seem to be giving each other a high five. This is Abul Gheit and Livni. And demonstrations take place in Egypt against Israel, but also based on the widespread perception that Egypt is complicit in the attacks against Gaza, as well as anger at Egypt's unwillingness to open the border crossing. And in fact, things escalate quite considerably the next day when Hassan Nasrallah, the most popular leader in the Arab world, speaking at a mass rally through video conference, says, quote, and again, these are my translations, "We say to the Egyptian regime, unless you open the Rafah crossing, unless you help your brothers in Gaza, then you are shurakat fil garima, partners or accomplices in the crime, accomplices to the killing, accomplices in the blockade or siege, accomplices in the Palestinian catastrophe." And then he directs his remarks to the, and again, these are my translations, the Muslim, Arab, generous, resisting, honorable people of Egypt. Let the Egyptian people in the millions take to the streets. Can the Egyptian police kill millions of Egyptians? No, they cannot. O Egyptian people, you must open the Rafah crossing with your chests. And he speaks about the noble Egyptian armed forces, and he calls on them, saying that I am not calling for a coup, but he calls on them to reason with those who make the political decisions in your country to not permit this continuing suffering. Of course, you know, this is a war of words, and the next day, Foreign Minister Abul Gheit harshly criticizes Nasrallah, saying that he wants to sow anarchy and chaos in Egypt and the region, and other Egyptian officials go even further, calling Nasrallah an agent of the Iranian regime. And it's at this point that President Mubarak declares himself that and announces that Egypt will not open the Rafah border crossing until, of course, the Palestinian Authority is in charge of the crossing, and refers back to the 2005 agreement governing the crossing that states that the Palestinian Authority has to be present as well as EU monitors. And he states that until this situation reverts to that, the crossing will not be opened. And of course, as you know, Gaza is essentially blockaded, and the Rafah crossing is really the only crossing outside, other than crossings with Israel, and it is quite crucial. It is largely closed during the entire period of the war. It is open at the seeming whim of the Egyptian regime. Sometimes humanitarian supplies are allowed in. Most often the border crossing is closed. Palestinians are not allowed to cross into Egypt. Major protests take place throughout the Arab world. I mean, they're quite really startling if you watch Al Jazeera regularly. In Mauritania, in Sudan, there are demonstrations of thousands of children in support of the Palestinians. In Tunisia, which is a police state and doesn't allow demonstrations take place. Even in Libya, there are demonstrations, of course, against Israel, but also critical of Egypt. And in fact, in Yemen, demonstrators break into the Egyptian consulate in Aden, throw computers and other equipment out the windows, and burn the Egyptian flag, and so on. And of course, there are demonstrations also in Lebanon and Syria in front of the Egyptian embassies, in which protesters criticize Israel, but also, of course, are quite adamant in their criticism of Egypt and Mubarak. And of course, in Egypt also, popular opinion is overwhelmingly against Egypt's position. There are, of course, some blemishes in this having to do with the killing of an Egyptian border guard by Hamas gunmen and so on. But largely, people in Egypt are furious at the government's position, and there are massive demonstrations throughout the country. So, for example, the leading independent newspaper, El Masri al-Yawm, states that on January 2nd there are 150 demonstrations in 17 different governorates out of Egypt's 26 governorates after Friday prayer. Hundreds of people are arrested, including hundreds of members of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Egyptian protesters are demanding a number of things. They're demanding a more active and effective Egyptian role in ending the Israeli strikes. They're, of course, demanding, opening of the Rafah border crossing, right? Because this is seen as crucial to at least some recourse that the Palestinians might have. But they're also calling for things that many in Egypt believe would be minimally required. For example, expelling the Israeli ambassador from Cairo, withdrawing the Egyptian ambassador from Tel Aviv, ending the sale of natural gas to Israel, which has been taken through the courts, and which the courts ruled actually was illegal initially because the deal did not go through the People's Assembly, but most recently a higher court has permitted the continuing sale of natural gas. And it needs to be noted also that there were a number of Arab states, in addition to Venezuela, that did take these measures. Of course, Mauritania and Qatar downgraded their relations with Israel. Qatar expelling the the Israeli trade representative in the country. Mauritania also downgrading relations. And of course, Hugo Chavez expelled almost everyone from the Israeli embassy in Caracas. And of course, the chants at these demonstrations in Egypt are also anti-Mubarak chants. And there are hundreds of thousands, literally, of people demonstrating. Again, El Masri al-Yawm, a week later, most of the demonstrations take place after Friday prayer, reports that, and a paper that is in no way friendly to the Muslim Brotherhood, claims that 200,000 people, Muslim brothers largely, are demonstrating on the Friday prayers, after Friday prayers. And these tensions also manifest themselves in the Egyptian parliament, which is largely dominated by the National Democratic Party, the party of President Mubarak. And on January 10th, debates take place between the Muslim Brotherhood members of parliament and the National Democratic Party members, with the ruling party members accusing the Muslim Brotherhood parliamentarians of being traitors and working for Egypt's enemies, meaning Hamas. And this escalates to the extent that one Muslim Brotherhood MP, Ashraf Bedruddin, takes off his shoe and throws it at a National Democratic Party parliamentarian, echoing what happened in Baghdad several months later, and so on. So things are really quite tense and unpleasant with regard to the Egyptian position on the Gaza war. Okay, moving to the next point, which is the kind of regional competition, Egypt and the new Cold War in the region. I think that it would be accurate to say that the fault lines in the region we witnessed recently are really not new, right, between the so-called moderate Arab states and states such as Iran, Syria, and groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. Previously, of course, as I mentioned, there was quite a considerable talk, not only in the region but also in Washington, of a Shia-Sunni divide, right? We saw this, of course, in the context of the Iraq War, with people talking about the regional impact of the Iraq War for Iraq, but also for the region. King Hussein famously of Jordan said in 2004 that there would be a new, quote, Shia crescent of dominant Shia movements or governments stretching from Iran into Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. President Mubarak also, in April 2006, on Al Arabiya television, talked about or claimed that most Shia, in fact, in the Arab world, were not loyal to their own nation states, but were loyal to Iran, as it were. And of course, these fault lines we saw manifest themselves in the last major conflict in the region, the July-August 2006 war between Hezbollah and Israel. In fact, it's quite, I think, useful to look at that conflict and what happened with regard to statements made by different governments, because they're largely the same. I mean, initially, after that war broke out on July 12, 2006, the Egyptian government, as well as many of the other so-called moderate Arab states, harshly criticized Hezbollah, with Mubarak on television stating kind of off the cuff that Hezbollah was responsible, that they are a state within a state, that if they take such measures, they need to consult with other Lebanese parties. And in fact, and we really haven't seen this before, at an Arab League meeting convened at the time, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, a number of Arab states and the Palestinian Authority criticize Hezbollah for their, quote, unexpected, inappropriate, and irresponsible acts with regard to the abduction of the Israeli soldiers and so on. And what's interesting or worthwhile noting is as that war continues in July and early August of 2006, and as the Israeli bombing becomes more intensive and extends deeper into Lebanon, targeting the Lebanese infrastructure as well as Hezbollah, really. And as Hezbollah is able to continue lobbing rockets into Israel, deeper into Israel, in fact, the positions of the Arab states, the so-called moderate Arab states, noticeably changes to be more in line with the position of the Arab publics. Of course, they condemn Israel in harsher tones, but they also try to demonstrate their support for the Lebanese resistance, with Jordan sending medical units into Lebanon, and Egypt also, quite interestingly enough, at the end of the war, President Mubarak dispatches his son, Gamal Mubarak, with a number of prominent Egyptians to Lebanon to show their solidarity with the Lebanese people. And of course, there are demonstrations throughout the Arab world. I was living in Cairo at the time, and it was quite incredible to see all groups, really, including secular opposition groups, including Christian politicians, holding up Hassan Nasrallah's photo in Cairo and supporting Hezbollah. And in fact, the public opinion polling that we have from that time and from the present demonstrates quite clearly that Hassan Nasrallah remains the most popular political leader in the region. I'm referring to the 2006 University of Maryland Zogby polls in which Hassan Nasrallah, the polls were of Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, UAE, the United Arab Emirates, and Lebanon, in which Hassan Nasrallah was the most popular leader in the Arab world. And of course, the 2008 polls show that his popularity has actually increased. So, no, there really is not a Sunni-Shia divide. That majorities in the Arab world supported Hezbollah, including the oldest Sunni Islamist organization, the Muslim Brotherhood, and in fact, the mother of all Sunni Islamist organizations, and in fact, the general guide of the Muslim Brotherhood, Mahdi Akif, at the time of the 2006 war, quite, I think, unwisely declared, boasting that he would send 10,000 Egyptians to fight with Hezbollah during that war. And most recently, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt has also defended Hassan Nasrallah's most recent remarks regarding the Gaza conflict and its criticism of the Egyptian government. So a more accurate way, of course, of understanding the fault lines in the region are really between regimes that are largely unpopular, corrupt and authoritarian, supported by the U.S. and pliant to American interests, and regimes and non-state actors, as I said before, both Sunni and Shia, that are outside of American influence and reject American and Israeli regional hegemony. Okay, let me conclude now in the way of a conclusion with regard to Egypt in the context of the Gaza war and the Obama administration and the likely consequences or posture changed, if it might be, with regard to Egypt. As I said at the beginning, I think Egypt has or is likely to benefit politically despite its seeming diplomatic impotence with regard to ending the conflict from the war, at least vis-a-vis Washington, by again highlighting its importance to Israel and to the United States in negotiating with Hamas over an eventual truce, in helping secure Israel's border, with regard to the stepped-up efforts that it is making, stopping smuggling through the tunnels, and of course continuing negotiating for the abducted Israeli soldier. As Aaron Miller said several weeks ago here at a panel on the Obama administration and the Middle East, Egypt is clearly pivotal for Israeli and American security interests. And of course, Egypt's continuing cooperation and compliance will likely come at a price for Washington. And I'm now thinking about, of course, the tense relations at times between Egypt and the United States and the Bush administration, particularly between 2003 and 2005, at the height of the so-called freedom agenda, quote unquote, in which there was significant pressure, unusually, exerted on Cairo to try to open up politically to some extent or within limits, and which did have some consequences, leading to directly or indirectly an opening of political space in Egypt, the amendment of the Constitution, and the first ever, in quotation marks, multi-candidate presidential elections in Egypt, and so on. And of course, quite famously, the pressure that was exerted by the Bush administration specifically for the release of Ayman Noor, the head of the Red Party, who was the second recipient of votes in the presidential elections in 2005. And quite interestingly, last week, Ayman Noor was released, unexpectedly to him, because he still has 2 years to go on his 5-year prison sentence, which is completely bogus for supposedly fraudulent signatures on his petition to form a political party. And in fact, I think that this is the first steps in trying to renegotiate a different Egyptian-American relationship. And I think I'll stop there, Ale.
Thank you very much, Samir. Yes, we'll now open the floor. Please wait for the mic and identify yourself. Yes. Just wait for the mic. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, I'm Steve Negus. I'm a fellow here at the Center. I covered Egypt in the 90s, and Egypt was during flare-ups in the Arab-Israeli conflict, Egypt was always very careful to sort of, I guess it's choose a diplomatic posture where it could pretend or act as though it were a check on Israeli power. That was a very, quite important aspect of how it portrayed itself to its own public. Now it seems like they've really sort of chucked that out and are rather almost, I would say, careless about being perceived as having their interests aligned with Israel in a way that seems, once again, sort of quite dangerous for them internally. I can think of no other way of getting under Mubarak's skin than sort of, calling on the Egyptian army to act as sort of an independent political actor. I guess the obvious thing that would have changed would have been the coming to power of Hamas and Hezbollah's popularity, and sort of, I guess, as a populist alternative to the government. But just wanted to know if you think there has been sort of that kind of dramatic change, and if so, what the causes might be.
Well, I think you're right that certainly the regional situation has changed quite significantly from that period, right? I don't think people were seriously concerned or as seriously concerned with Iranian hegemony in the region at the time. Certainly, Hezbollah was not as powerful as a force ideologically as it has been over the last number of years. In fact, we're likely to see Hezbollah do well in the upcoming Lebanese elections. And certainly Hamas was not in power at the time and did not achieve an electoral victory as it did on January 26th, 2006. So, and this gets back to the third point that I made, and in fact, maybe the only point that has any kind of residue of being profound, which is that I think we really do need to think about what the character of the Egyptian mediating relationship is with regard to Hamas in particular. I rarely feel sorry for governments or movements. I rarely feel sorry for the Egyptian government, and I rarely feel sorry for Hamas, but Hamas actually has to negotiate, with both the Israelis and with a hostile really Arab partner in that mediation, and so I think the kind of short answer to your question is a changed regional situation. Possibly, you could speculate that the Mubarak regime has become even less popular from the 1990s, and that one of the only remaining sources of support comes from Washington. If one wanted to be, a bit daring, I guess.
Henry, and then Henry, just wait for the mic. Yes, please.
Right. With all due respect to you and Aaron, I don't see Egypt as being very pivotal. They do seal the border, but if they didn't seal the border, Israel would seal it. And they can't produce any agreement with Hamas or the Palestinian Authority. But I'd like to ask you about Mr. Obama and how he's perceived in the region now. There was a great shine about him. Has it faded since he hasn't done very much for the people of Gaza? And if he embarks on some sort of enterprise with Iran, is that going to hurt him with President Mubarak? How do you see the Obama administration shaping up in Egypt?
Sure. Well, let me also briefly respond to your first point, and I actually don't think that there is a tremendous disagreement between our views with regard to Egypt being pivotal. In some ways, as I said at the beginning, Egypt has failed to deliver, right? And I think there's no question that its regional significance has declined quite considerably over the last 10 or 15 years. We've just seen recently the release of the National Intelligence Council report that states that Egypt's regional influence has declined. But you'd have to have been blind to not awake for the last 10 or 15 years to miss that point. Egypt has declined regionally in a number of different ways. Even if we were simply to look at, for example, media and popular culture, with the rise of Arab satellite stations, with the rise of Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya, and so on, with production of TV also moving to the Gulf, with Lebanese pop music dominating the Egyptian music scene, there's no question that Egypt has declined in terms of regional influence, and I don't think it's pivotal in one sense. It's pivotal in another sense, but certainly there's been a decline. With regard to how President Obama is perceived in Egypt, it's quite interesting. I was actually in Cairo on Election Day, having voted absentee before, and I was meeting with all different kinds of people, including the highest ranks of people in the regime, at the very highest levels, as well as I always do, and my current research takes me to members of the Muslim Brotherhood at the highest levels. And what was quite remarkable is that everyone was very much supportive and hopeful about an Obama administration. I don't think, as well as people on the street, as well as the majority of Egyptians, I don't think they know what they're getting. Certainly, one of the things was that it's going to be an administration other than the Bush administration, which has been disastrous in different kinds of ways. And I think that people in the Egyptian opposition believe or hope that the Obama administration will be more sincerely committed to championing things like human rights and rule of law and so on with regard to Egypt. I think members in the Egyptian government are hopeful that the freedom agenda, which really ended at the end of 2005 and 2006 with the victory of 88 Muslim brothers in the Egyptian parliamentary elections at the end of 2005, with the Hamas victory in 2006, and with the Hezbollah war in 2006, the Bush administration learned a lesson, which is free and fair elections in the Middle East often lead to Islamists coming to power who are quite hostile to American interests. But nevertheless, the Egyptian government certainly doesn't want anything like that. And I think they're also kind of hopeful with regard to the Obama administration. Gaza, in some ways, was a kind of, I want to say, wake-up call, but I think it tempered the optimism and enthusiasm, and we will see. I think that there's no question that with regard to the stated ambitions of the Obama administration, they will be much more modest. I don't think there will really be any talk of democracy promotion. I think that, people have realized that that is a failed endeavor in the sense that it is nearly impossible to produce democratic states elsewhere, and that the talk or the framing of the discussion might be more in terms of supporting human rights, supporting rule of law, and these kinds of good governance issues, as opposed to the lofty and transformative, issue of democracy. And I think that, with just a last point, if President Mubarak is or doesn't take favorably to better U.S.-Iranian relations, that will really have little consequence. Most people, I think, in the Arab world, and this can be tempered quite somewhat with regard to the Gulf states, which are much closer to Iran, don't view Iran as a threat, and don't view, and the polling data actually shows that as well. The largest threat that's perceived is Israel, followed by the United States.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, the Center, for having this seminar. This is so helpful, and thank you for your talk. It comes to my mind that there is a zero-sum game between Iran and Israel, and Egypt and the other part of members of the Quartet can play a positive sum game to close the relationship between Iran and Israel, instead of to play a zero-sum game between Israel. By now, the Quartet regimes try to use the zero-sum game between Israel and Iran in order to make themselves attractive to the West. The result of this situation, as you agree, is that Iran could win in the region. I mean, so there is no problem between Shiite and Sunnis. There is no problem between Persian and Arabs. But the problem is now between Israel and the region. Is there any possibility that, this is my, let's say, somehow proposal, that a 4-4-4-2-4 means a quartet plus Iran and Turkey within Islamic Conference could come ahead and join the quartet, international quartet, to resolve the case? Thank you.
I don't think that there would be much acceptance of that from Israel or the United States with regard to, Iranian involvement in any kind of mediating of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So, I think that maybe another way to get at some of the same issues that you're talking about is imagining what a more powerful and nuclear Iran might mean for regional dynamics, as well as what kind of incentives that provides states in the region, particularly Israel, to try to resolve maybe more enthusiastically the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I think that's maybe another way of looking at this. An Iran with nuclear weapons might provide some kind of incentive that isn't presently the case for Israel. And I'm not supporting this. I'm just, wondering out loud to resolve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in a way that is minimally acceptable to the Palestinians and the Arab world. But I will leave the Iranian matters to my...
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Sumita Pawa from Johns Hopkins. Just following up on your question about what use Egypt really is to the U.S. and the region anymore, I would actually argue that as a U.S. or Israel proxy that was supposed to sell the peace policy to the Arabs, since Egypt has failed so miserably, would the U.S. perhaps consider reframing its relationship with Egypt and trying to get Egypt and Israel to cooperate more in the way that Turkey and Israel have been? Because Turkey is an interesting example. Yes, it's an elected government which has Islamists in power. They get up, the Prime Minister can get up at Davos and give the Israeli government grief for what it's been doing in Gaza, but the strategic relationship between Turkey and Israel has not suffered considerably. And is that perhaps a more durable model for the U.S. in the region if it wants to have allies, if it wants to have regional powers who can sort of keep the peace? Would that be a better model than essentially just buying off the Egyptians?
Right. It's a very good question, and I'm going to ineffectively answer it. But I think that there are a couple of points I think to be made. One is that even though there is a great deal of sympathy, certainly within Turkey, for the Palestinians, the situation, of course, is fundamentally different. We're talking about a country, Egypt, that has been at war with Israel, in 48, 56, 67. We always forget the War of Attrition, 69 and 70, meaning that the 6th Arab War was really the 7th Arab-Israeli War, and so on in 73. This is fundamentally different than Turkey. So I think it would be much harder to sell a policy in Egypt that is similar to the Turkish-Israeli arrangement. And then the second, kind of reaction that I have to your question is that it's precisely because of Turkey's democracy that Prime Minister Erdogan can, even before his actions at the Davos summit, he, of course, and I didn't talk about this in my lecture, he made a trip in the region and visited, of course, Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Syria and so on, and denounced Israel in very strong language, much harsher than what we saw from really any of the so-called moderate Arab states. And it is precisely because of the democratic character of that regime that he can do something like that, really. So, we can imagine a different Egyptian-Israeli relationship, but that would require, I think, some fundamentally different structural conditions inside Egypt. But again, theoretically, it is not at all impossible to imagine a situation in which Egypt is not only maintaining a cold peace, but a relatively lukewarm peace with Israel. I mean, if you remember the period immediately after the signing of the Camp David Accords, there was some enthusiasm and some optimism that this would significantly benefit Egypt for all different kinds of reasons. There was a kind of war wariness, and there were some public opinion polling at the time that was done that actually demonstrated, Raymond Hinnebusch is the person who's done this, demonstrated that Egyptians were quite open to the possibility of, peaceful, lukewarm to possibly warm relations with its northeasternly neighbor.
Yes, please. This way.
Maria Steffen from the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. My question is Samar, how do you think Ayman Noor will navigate the new political situation, given that, the Mubarak regime may have gained international legitimacy as a result of its response to Gaza, and is certainly presenting itself as the indispensable regional leader, which will gain a lot of adherents. But on the other hand, its domestic popularity and legitimacy has plummeted. So if you're an Ayman Noor, on the one hand, you could try to exploit the unpopularity of the regime and promote unity between liberal, secular oppositionists and the Muslim Brotherhood leaders. But on the other hand, you may not want the Islamist agenda to dominate talk of secession and democratic transition. So how do you think Noor will navigate this new situation?
Well, I think that, there's a couple of points to be made, I think, initially, that Ayman Noor in many ways is more popular in the United States than he is in Egypt. And I think we see this quite a bit with individuals who are focused on by American officials and so on. In fact, if anything, this is something that's happened, the phenomena that I'm about to describe happened with our friend Saadettin Ibrahim. When Saadettin Ibrahim was first convicted in Egypt of phony charges and so on, there was a great deal of skepticism towards him by the Egyptian public. He had done a number of things, including having statements and I think possibly visiting Israel that didn't really endear him to the Egyptian public. But as a result of him being in jail, he gained a tremendous amount of credibility, I think. And today his position and standing in Egypt is fundamentally different than it was at the beginning. I think that so the first point is Ayman Noor is less popular, I think, and less plausible than many in the United States or outside of Egypt believe. That's the first point. The second point is a technical point, and that is that because of Ayman Noor's conviction, even though I have no doubt that it was bogus, he is technically prohibited from running in elections, meaning parliamentary elections in 2010 and presidential elections in 2011, the next scheduled presidential elections. So that really removes him from the political stage. So the regime accomplished what it wanted to do. It kind of taught him a lesson. It also taught the American administration and Condoleezza Rice a lesson, because Ayman Noor was, as I often said, her favorite Egyptian, meaning that there are 10,000 other people in jail as well, but nevertheless she focused quite a bit on him. And so on, and still the playing field is there for an elected succession of President Mubarak's son, Gamal Mubarak, which is the most likely succession scenario. So I don't know if Ayman Noor will, have any more traction in the coming period than he's had in the past. And the last point, just very small, is you're right that the divisions between Islamists and secular opposition people are still unfortunately, a barrier to a more mass-based democratic movement in the country.
Samir, maybe you care to comment. We have a few minutes left on the succession, knowing that Gamal Mubarak is going to be here next week just for a day and a half. So
Sure.
If you could just then we'll divide that.
Sure.
Thank you.
In brief, there were constitutional amendments that took place in Egypt in 2005 and in 2007. In 2005, specifically relating to one article of the Constitution that has to do with presidential elections, and then in 2007, that article was amended and many others were. And I think many people quite correctly analyzed much of the significance of these constitutional amendments as creating a legal, quote-unquote, mechanism by which Gamal Mubarak can run for elected office, the presidency, and win the elections and become president in a formally, quote-unquote, legal way, an electoral way. But, of course, that would be devoid of any kind of legitimacy. So, we've seen this institutionally take place in Egypt. We've also seen something that leaders do, which is the elimination of potential competitors, whether they are real competitors or imaginary competitors, like Ayman Noor, for example, and charges. And we saw that earlier also in Egypt in the 1980s and the 1990s with popular military figures, as well as popular, politicians. So I think that the most likely succession scenario, in brief, in Egypt, because the next presidential elections are scheduled for 2011, is, assuming President Mubarak lives that long, which I think he will, he's 80 years old and will celebrate his 81st birthday on May 4th, is that shortly before the next scheduled presidential elections, he will declare to the Egyptian people that he has served the country for, at that time it'll be 29 or 30 years, and that Egypt has made tremendous progress, and that he will step down after the next presidential elections, which are multi-party and democratic and so on. At that point, there will be spontaneous, quote-unquote, demonstrations in Egypt among members of the ruling party, as well as the general public, that demand that Gamal Mubarak run for president, that he not be nominated and so on. He will refuse initially, but then he will, because of the overwhelming pressure, accept the heavy responsibility that has been placed on his shoulders. He will run in these elections, and as I mentioned before, the constitutional tailoring is incredible, meaning that it is virtually impossible for anybody to meet the legal qualifications necessary in order to run for president. And this has been designed specifically for this. And in fact, these authoritarian models have then subsequently been adopted by Tunisia and Algeria also as a way of limiting electoral competition for the highest position after Egypt. And the elections will take place. There will be some bogus political parties that nobody, even those who follow Egyptian politics daily like myself, have heard of, nominate competitors. And the elections will take place, and Gamal Mubarak will emerge as an elected president of Egypt. The only other scenario is a military individual. So.
Thank you very much, Samir. This was amazing.
Thank you very much,
for the
Ella.
whole tour d'horizon about what's going on in Egypt.
Thank you.